Thank you for joining us. I'm John Becker. A modern-day signature series here at WBIR is Appalachian Unsolved. We look at old murders, cold cases where investigators need help delivering justice to victims and their families. During the next half hour, we revisit several of those stories. Investigators hope something you see could help them solve these mysterious murders. We begin with a story of a murder for specifically officially unsolved reasons, some 30 years after it happened. October 20th, 1992, a wooded area of Knoxville turned into an unusual crime scene. It was a case many investigators thought would lead to a clear and final conclusion. Leslie Ackerson explains why, to this day, it remains unsolved.
Stand up, foreman.
There was evidence, even a confession.
Stand up and look at him and say you are guilty of every charge.
But Knoxville's first serial killer case will always be unsolved.
It's an unfinished case. It's an unresolved question.
It was October 1992, the week before Halloween, when these woods off Cahaba Lane turned into a crime scene. Investigators later identified the victims as 4 women: Patricia Rose Anderson, Patricia Johnson, Darlene Smith, and Susan Stone. They'd been raped, bound, and strangled. Some had a history of prostitution. That would help lead investigators to a man named Tom Husky, known to local prostitutes as the Zoo Man.
He worked with his father at the Knoxville Zoo, and his job was cleaning up after the elephants.
At his home, authorities found key evidence.
He took mementos, earrings, rings, money.
Chief David Davenport then worked with TBI and would later sit down with Husky, making a shocking discovery.
First time I talked to him, it was Tom. And we left the room to get some paperwork, and we come back, and he was Kyle. And from Kyle, he progressed to Philip Dax, was an aristocrat. He had the voice down pretty good. He could have been an actor.
One of Husky's personalities, Kyle, confessed to the murders.
I thought it was all act. I think the whole system got debunked.
I never had any doubt.
Former District Attorney General Randy Nichols got the case.
It was the first time, of course, that I had been called upon to decide whether or not we were going to try to kill somebody.
Nichols prosecuted Husky for rapes and kidnappings he committed before the killings, securing convictions in 1996, sending Husky to prison. But the murder trial would be tougher to prosecute.
I misjudged it tremendously.
The defense argued insanity, and in his closing arguments, Monsieur even channeled one of the personalities to prove a point.
And I walked over and got on the witness stand and says, "My name's Kyle. I hate Tommy. I want to get rid of Tommy. I'll do anything to get. I hate him." Like that, and then got up off the witness stand and says, "Now that's your witness. You believe that?"
Nichols believed it was a cunning act.
And I'll go to my grave believing that the last victim, he had literally driven from Cahaba Lane to the mobile home where he lived, and I don't believe it. She had been dead an hour.
Unable to come up with a decision, the jury hung. The deadlock meant a mistrial. Then in a twist, courts ruled the search warrant improper and credibility of evidence flawed, meaning a retrial would be unlikely.
I would have made some different decisions, some other strategies. I've lived it a lot.
Today, the Zoo Man remains in a Tennessee prison for rape, but he will never serve a day in his life for murder.
In my view, he should never be put back into a free society. I believe him to be a very dangerous man.
As for the 4 women killed, no one was ever convicted for their murders.
Online right now, all of our Appalachian Unsolved cases and how you can help authorities bring closure for their families. One of those stories is Michelle Anderson. In January of 1987, that Fulton High School junior, who was 15 at the time, disappeared. Her remains were found 2 years later. Anderson had attended a party invited by a man named Larry Lee Smith. Investigators say he gave the teens, including Michelle, alcohol and pot, and supposedly gave Michelle a ride home. She was never seen alive again. Larry Lee Smith is a convicted sex offender in many states, currently serving a sentence in Tennessee. He will never get out of prison. Authorities say he preyed on women for 40 years. He is behind bars for aggravated kidnapping and aggravated rape. In 2021, he challenged his guilty verdicts, but a judge said no. He has never been charged with the death of Michelle Anderson. One of Knoxville's oldest unsolved murder cases happened in the 1960s to a Knoxville housewife named Rose Bush. The 68-year-old was baking a cake inside her Sequoia Hills home when someone stabbed and beat her to death. November 19, 1968. Those familiar with the case do say the killer or killers dressed as police officers to get inside that home. Although the next murder case actually happened in Maryland, the case moved to our area because of the Smoky Mountains. From the outside, it looked like William Bradford Bishop had it all. He was a Yale graduate, fluent in 5 languages with a beautiful family. But in reality, there were cracks in the facade of that perfect family. In March of 1976, Bishop brutally murdered his family in Maryland, dumping their bodies in the North Carolina woods and abandoning his car at the Elkmont campground, and has never been seen since. Again, that was in 1975, and an artist created a model of what she believed Bishop would look like today. He hasn't been seen in almost 45 years. In November of 2021, we shared an update about this case with the story of Kathy Gilchrist. Through a DNA test, she found out that she is the illegitimate daughter. The FBI finally did its own DNA testing and confirmed there was a new lead in the case.
She told me that she was absolutely shocked, but yes, the evidence showed that I was indeed matched to Brad. It was kind of creepy when I found out it was for real. It did make me pause for a minute and say, wait a minute, this is scary. It started on Mother's Day. I started getting these phone calls.
I'm 99.9% sure I know who he is.
He swore that Brad Bishop lived very reclusively in a little shack of some kind in upstate Wisconsin. A message from an EMT who formerly lived in California, and he said, I've been trying to reach you because I know I treated Brad Bishop 2 years ago.
Kathy says she thinks Bishop is still alive, and if she did meet him, she would turn him in. You can watch all of our Appalachian Unsolved cases through the WBIR app. For the United States' most prolific serial killer, murder was an obsession. Samuel Little admitted to killing 93 women in a 35-year killing spree across America. His victims included at least 2 women in East Tennessee, but he never was charged with their crimes. Little was a cruel man who thought of nothing of humiliating Knoxville women, including one woman who lay dying. We take a closer look at what you want to see, but first, a warning. This story is graphic and disturbing.
Everybody described him as really a nice, gentle person when you first met him. Slick, I mean, a good talker, able to talk his way out of into things.
Sometime around Christmas, 1974, a killer came to town. By the time he left, he'd notched another victim. A drifter, a thief. Ohio native Samuel Little murdered Knoxvillian Martha Cunningham, likely on New Year's Eve night, 1974. Little preyed on prostitutes, addicts. Cunningham was no prostitute, but she was vulnerable, a woman of God cursed to cross paths with a serial killer. Family members had last heard from her that New Year's Eve night. The 34-year-old was supposed to be at church on Parkview Avenue.
From what he told us was that he had seen her on more than one occasion. And then on New Year's Eve, he brought her out to the woods, strangled her, and killed her.
Veteran lawman David Davenport suspects Little drove her from the Magnolia area heading east about 15 minutes toward remote woods off Oglesby Road, a spot where no one could hear her above the drone of nearby Interstate 40. He left her body splayed on the ground. Little treated her like so many of his victims, robbing her of any dignity, leaving her slip and dress up over her chest and her stockings and panties pulled down to her thighs. No respect, no regard. Hunters found her body more than 3 weeks later. Fate would deal Martha Cunningham another indignity. Records show authorities didn't investigate her death as a homicide. Despite the circumstances, out by herself in a remote location in a disheveled state, investigators found no signs of foul play. The autopsy's conclusion, quote, no obvious cause of death was noted. Decades passed. Eventually, only family and friends remembered Martha Cunningham. And then in 2018, Little decided it was time to confess. Once prosecutors promised Little they wouldn't seek the death penalty, he started talking about all the horrors he had inflicted. Not one, not 10, not 20 killings. No, he confessed to murdering 93 women, starting in 1970 when he was 30 years old. He drew pictures of many of their faces, claiming he had a photographic memory.
We really wanted me to move out of there. So we, instead of going in there, I took her the other way.
To the surprise of Knox County investigators, his confessions included Cunningham, who he remembered as Martha. The FBI alerted the sheriff's office. Working cold cases for the county, Davenport checked out Little's story.
He gave us so many things about her that made us believe that he was telling the truth.
The old convict claimed he'd also killed a black prostitute in Knoxville around the same time.
And from what he described, he dumped her body somewhere in the city limits of Knoxville, but we never could find anything that fit that description.
That woman's body has never been found. Samuel Little died in a Texas prison at the age of 80 back in 2020. Investigative journalist and my colleague John North has worked many of these Appalachian Unsolved cases. And John, let's talk about this case in particular, mishandled from the get-go.
It's kind of extraordinary and a travesty, to be honest with you, John. I mean, if you come upon a victim who is lying there, been dead several weeks, their genitals are exposed, their clothing clearly has been pulled down, you don't think it's a natural.
You don't. Let's talk about other things that stood out to you in this case in particular.
Well, one thing that strikes me is, well, first of all, we didn't even know that it was a homicide. We had completely forgotten, the investigators had, about this case until Samuel Little himself came forward and said, essentially, oh, by the way, I killed a woman in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1975. That's just amazing. And it was the cold case investigator in 2018 then had to go back and try to assemble what Samuel Little had been telling him.
John, we're going to get to it in a second, but technology is helping solve more of these cases.
Yeah, it's incredible. Almost every day now we are seeing breaks locally, statewide, nationally in cases, simply because DNA profiling has become so much more sophisticated.
Investigative journalist John North, you can read more of his reporting online at WBIR.com right now and other Appalachian Unsolved cases. Again, finally today, modern technology is offering new clues into mysterious deaths, ones that are decades old, including a 1985 case where the remains of a teenager were found in a remote area of Campbell County, miles from the interstate. For years, they were referred to as baby girl. But just a few months ago, a break came in that case, and we now know her name, Tracy Sue Walker. Here is more from Leslie Ackerson.
You normally don't find young females just lying around dead in the woods, you know.
Leading the forensic team was renowned anthropologist Dr. Bill Bass.
That tells me she's a teenager right there, that she is not over 16.
Bass believes the key lies in her forgotten smile.
That is dental work, and it is good dental work. So she grew up in a family that valued dental care. We wrote about 60 to 80 dentists in the Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina area. We didn't hear from any of them. If a dentist could see that dental work, I think they would know whether it was their work or not.
Nature tells Bass the remains had been there before their first discovery.
I think she's been dead at least 2 years, could be more.
Investigators want you to take a look at Tracy Sue Walker. This was one of 156. She was 15 or 16 when she went missing in 1978. That was from Indiana. Again, this case is unsolved. Authorities say if you can help, they want to hear from you. It's one case that legendary forensic specialist, Dr. Bill Bass, has remembered all these years later, and how the technology could help.
DNA has probably been the biggest thing that has occurred. See, 20 years ago, we really didn't have DNA. I mean, we thought about it and tinkered with it and see if we could make it work. But now we know what it is, how to do it, and you're going to see more human identifications in the next few years because of the use of DNA in it.